We're going to look at God's nature, his personality, two misconceptions about God. First of all, we're going to look at God, of course, is often viewed wrongly that he's impersonal. A couple of ways that he's viewed as an impersonal God is that God is just a force. We said a few weeks ago that that would be the thought of modernism. The problem with that is when we believe that God is just a force, something bigger than us somewhere out there somewhere, that most people will acknowledge that. They'll say, I believe that there's something, bigger out there than me. I believe maybe there's a God even, they'll go as far to say. But really, under that misconception, because they don't have a relationship with God, they don't answer to that greater force, really, they stop just at the acknowledgement of it. They say, I know there's something bigger out there. And if we're going to live a good Christian life, we have to do more than just acknowledge God. We have to have a relationship with him, and we have to know that he expects things of us and expects us to live a certain way. So misconceptions about God is that he's just a force out there somewhere. Another misconception is that God is just nature. That would be pantheism, that God is all and all is God. God is not a mere force of nature. God is a real person. Let's look at personality. What does personality mean? You say, that guy, he has a personality like a rock. He doesn't have a personality. What does that mean? What is personality? Personality consists of three aspects: emotion, will, and intellect. Emotion, will, and intellect. There was a guy, he found out that he was talking about emotion. He found out that he had an identical twin. And he got really emotional about it when he met his identical twin. He was beside himself. So let us give that a second to soak in. But emotions. What is personality? It's emotion, having feelings, right? And often men are the ones who are said to not be in touch with their feelings, or we have feelings, but we tend to just push them aside, and sadness, that doesn't matter, I'm just going to push it aside. Whatever it is, usually the emotion that men generally end up showing is anger, right, or frustration. But emotions are what make somebody a person, right, personal. Another thing that consists of personality is your will. Right now, Tucker and Quinn are realizing that they have an option of when dad or mom says, do this, they're realizing, I can not do that. I can put a thought together and decide I'm not going to obey. They're exercising their will. And one thing that Tucker's saying right now, I'll say, Tucker, go pick up your shoes. And he'll say, no, you do not say me what to do, Dad. We find out that Dad does, in fact, say him what to do. But he's finding out that he has a will, and we're working on breaking that will. Not breaking it necessarily, but, bringing it under subjection, but a will. Realizing that God has, what do we say all the time? This is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So what does a personality consist of? Emotions, will, and also intellect. What makes a person is that they're not a robot. They can think, they can gather information, they can use that information to conjure thoughts. So if this is the definition of a personality, then does God have a personality? Absolutely. God is real. He has emotions, God has a will, and God has intellect. So let's move down to the next thought, which is proofs of God's personality. We've pretty much understood that God has personality, so let's give a few proofs. How do we know God has a personality? Number one, his names prove it. Look at Genesis, or don't turn there, I'll read it. Genesis chapter 22, verse 13. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. This is when Abraham goes up into the mountain. He is going to sacrifice his son Isaac, and he sees the ram that's caught in the bush that God provided. Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. What does that name Jehovah-Jireh mean? The Lord our provider. An impersonal force does not provide for its own. I have worked around a lot of apple trees in my day. When I was in high school, I worked at Kanabe's apple farm, pruning the trees, and then picking up all the fallen apples off the ground and putting them in bulk crates. I have picked up not millions, but thousands of apples in my day. And I have never seen an apple fall from a tree and the tree limbs bend down and pick it up and bring it back up into the tree. Never seen it. Why? Because an impersonal force, an inanimate object, does not care for its own. It grows the fruit, it falls off, and if somebody doesn't pick it up, it rots, and it's gone, right? But God cares for his own, Jehovah Jireh, our provider. Another name of God that shows that he cares for us is found in Psalm 23, verse 1. You could probably quote the first verse. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Jehovah, what is the name of the next piece there that means God is our shepherd? Jehovah, 4 letters, starts with an A. Jehovah, or starts with an R, Jehovah Ra. That means the Lord our shepherd. And we could go through all the names of God, and they all point and indicate to the fact that God is not an impersonal force. God is someone who cares for us. He's intelligent, he's loving, and he thinks about us. He plans for us, and he cares for us. How do we know that God has a personality? First of all, his names prove it. Number 2, because of the contrast between him and idols. You turn to Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 3. This is sometimes a passage that some people will take out of context and use it as a proof that Christians shouldn't use Christmas trees. Verse 3, for the custom of the people are vain, for one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. What this is talking about, not about Christmas trees at all. It's talking about taking a piece of wood and shaping it in some way, shape, or form into an idol to be worshipped. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. Notice over the next couple of verses, it is going to really lay out what a false god or a false idol cannot do. They are upright as a palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, meaning you have to carry them around. They can't move on their own, because they cannot go. Be afraid of them, for they cannot. Be not afraid of them, for they can't do evil. Neither also is it in them to do good. For as much as there is none like unto thee, O Lord, thou art great. So now we're going to hear barely a comparing and a contrasting between the Lord and idols. O Lord, thou art great, and thy name is great in might. Who would not fear thee, O King of nations? For to thee doth it appertain, for as much as among all the wise men of the nations and in all their kingdoms there is none like unto thee. They are altogether brutish and foolish. The stock is a doctrine of vanity. Silver spread into plates is brought from Tarshish, gold from Uphaz, the work of the workmen, and of the hands of the founder. Blue and purple is their clothing. They are all the works of cunning men. Here we go, verse 10. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God, and an everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shall tremble, and all the nations shall not be able to abide his indignation. Thus, the last verse we'll read, thus shall ye say unto them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. Idols cannot speak. According to this passage alone, they cannot talk, they cannot see, they cannot hear, they cannot answer prayers. That's why God said, don't make any graven images. Why? First of all, because it takes away from us worshiping God, but secondly, they can't do anything for us. They're worth nothing. But God, just in this passage, it proves that he can walk, he can speak, he can do good, he can express wrath, he has intellect, he has a will for us, and he hears. How do we know that God has a personality? First of all, because his names prove it. Secondly, because of the vast difference between all other gods, false gods, idols, and the true God. Number 3, because his emotions prove it. God experiences, and for sake of time, I'm just going to give you the reference, but I do have a reference for each one of these. Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, it shows that God experiences sorrow and grief. Usually, the things that bring God sorrow and grief, us, his creation. We're a vast disappointment to God in the most part, since man began to sin. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9 shows that God has anger. Deuteronomy 6, verse 15 shows that God has jealousy. Revelations chapter 3, verse 19 shows that God has love. And Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16, that God hates. I believe that verse is, these 6 things doth the Lord hate. These 7 are an abomination unto him. It's important to note that God experiences all these emotions, what we would consider positive emotions, love, and quote-unquote negative emotions, anger, without sinning. God does not sin. And I did a Sunday school lesson a couple of years ago now. It always baffled me as a young person how it says, the anger of the Lord was kindled. And I thought, how could God be angry but yet be perfect? Well, anger is an emotion. Anger is not sin in and of itself. It's an emotion that God gave us. If now that I have a young children, if there's a man that's taking one of my children away from me, I'm going to have a certain amount of anger that comes up within me, right? That's not wrong. That's an emotion that God gave me to protect my children. Now, if I cuss at them and beat them to death, then that's sin, right? So the Bible says, be angry, sin not. So God expresses all these emotions and many, many more, but it's important to note that God does not sin within those emotions. One more proof that God has personality. First, his name. Show it, the contrast between false gods and him, his emotions, and lastly, his involvement in our lives. There's some beliefs that say that God created the world and then just left it. And that is partly true. God did create the world, but God didn't just leave us to spin in the galaxies all by ourselves. God has his hand in and all throughout our lives. How do we see that? Well, in Genesis 1, verse 1, God's the creator. And God created not just the world and the animals and Adam and Eve, but God creates every human life. God gives life even now, even at this very second. There's babies being born all across the world, and God is the one who gives that life. He's the creator. In Hebrews chapter 13, the whole chapter really talks about God being the sustainer. He not only gives life, but he upholds it. In Psalm 104, it talks about him watching over man and knowing what man needs. I'm glad that God watches over me and he knows what I need. There's a lot of different times in my life I can look back and recognize the times that God was watching out for me. He was caring for me. When you were spinning out of control and the Lord helps you not get into an accident, or you did get into an accident, but he gave you protection, or a bunch of other scenarios like that. But I believe that there's multitudes more times in my life that I truly have no idea that God was watching out for me, whether it be a delay that I had that kept me from something, or maybe I left early, or you go throughout your day and you never know what God is from what God is keeping you. But I'm glad he watches over me. He knows what I need. Also, this isn't in totality what his involvement in my life, but he's also the judge of the earth. He controls who rules. God is the one who gives the rise and fall of nations and leaders, and that is proven in Psalm 75, verses 6 and 7. Many more other things we could talk about where God has his hand in our lives. But that just shows that God is a personal God. He cares about us. He loves us. He wants to be involved in our lives. He's not just a force. He is an incredible, really, I hate to say man because he's not a man, but he is a person that we can get to know. A force can't do these things. Since God is a real person, he has real desires, and he desires to have a real relationship with you. My question to you this evening is, how real is God to you?